Creating Ribbits is relatively simple, and we're going to start with the view model. Now this is going to be a very easy class to write because we will only have one property, because our form is going to have only one field, the status field. And you might ask yourself, well, why do we need to create a view model for such a simple form? And the answer is model validation. We practically get that for free. And if we want to follow the Twitter model, then our Ribbits have to be a max of 140 characters. So let's call this class Create Ribbit View Model, and its sole property is going to be called status, and it of course is going to be a string. This obviously is required, so we will add the required attribute, and we really don't need to specify an error message there. And we're going to use another attribute called max length. This basically says that the status value cannot be more than 140 characters. And then our error message will describe that. Status cannot be more than 140 characters. And that's our view model. Next, we're going to create a partial view that's going to contain our create form. Let's add this to our shared folder, and I'm going to call it underscore create partial. Or rather, let's call this create ribbit partial. This is a strongly typed view, although we haven't built our application since we wrote this class, so I'm just going to type in create ribbit view model, and this is a partial view. So let's add it. Let's add an h1 element that says create a ribbit. Then let's have a paragraph element that's going to contain our form. We'll start with the using statement, var form equals HTML begin form. Now watch this. I'm going to be posting this to the index action method on home. This seems a little weird right now, but I will explain why I am doing this here in a minute. Let's create our text area. I'm going to use the text area for method, and I'm going to specify the status property. And we want to give this a CSS class of ribbit text. And then we just need our input element for the submit button. And we also need the anti-forgery. I am not going to forget it this time. So the reason why I am posting to the index action method is because this is going to be rendered as part of a child action. And you cannot make requests for child actions. The reason why I'm going to make this a child action is so that we can use this in other parts of the application rather easily. It's basically going to treat our create ribbit form as a component. It'll be self-contained and isolated from any of the other forms and models within our other views. And because of this, we kind of need our own error message area here. So I'm going to open up the underscore layout file, and I'm going to pull this little bit of code here, and I'm going to paste it underneath the h1 element. So if we do have something wrong with our model, at least if it did not validate, then we can display that error message. But instead of using the summary, I'm going to use the validation message for method and specify the status property. Next, let's go to the home controller and let's write the code for our create action methods. I think we already have a post version, but we do need a get version as well. So let's copy this and paste it. Except the get version does not need to validate the anti-forgery token, but we are also going to add another attribute to these action methods, and it is a child action only. So if we try to make a request directly for these action methods, then we are going to get an exception. The get version is very simple. We are simply going to return a partial view of underscore create ribbit partial, and we'll pass in a new create ribbit view model. The post version is going to be a little bit more complicated. Because this is a child action, we cannot redirect to another action. If we want to redirect, we have to use the response.redirect method. So the first thing we'll do is check the model state and see if it's valid. So if model state is valid, then we will create that new ribbit. Otherwise, we want to return the partial view of underscore create ribbit partial and pass in model. And we get this model from the parameter. So let's add the parameter. The type is create ribbit view model, and we'll just call it model. So if the model state is valid, then we want to create the ribbit, and we will do that with our ribbit service. But we do not have a ribbit service yet. So let's go to our ribbit controller base class, and let's add that ribbit service. First, we need a property of type iRibbitService, and we will just call the property Ribbits. But like our user service, we want this to be privately set. And then in the constructor, we will create a new Ribbit service and pass in our data context. So now that we have that, let's go back to our home controller and let's create our Ribbit. So we'll use ribbits.create. And the create method, as we wrote it, wants a user object. Well, we don't really need a user object. All we need is the user ID. We could get a user, but that requires hitting the database, and that's something that is not necessary. So let's modify our Ribbit service. It's fine that we have a create method with a user, but let's write an overload that lets us pass in a user ID. So let's go to our services namespace. Let's open up iRibbitService and the Ribbit service, and let's add that overload. So in the interface, I'm just going to copy the current create method, and I'm going to change the first parameter to an int user ID. And then in the service, we'll add that new method. Let's copy and paste our current create method, and we will just need to make a few modifications. First of all, we need to change the first parameter to an integer. Then when we are creating the ribbit, let's set the author ID to that user ID. But then we don't want to use this add for method. Instead, we want to call the create method on our repository and pass in that ribbit. And then we could modify our other create method to call our other overload. So return create user.id, then status, and then created. The next thing we're going to do is display our timeline. So while we are here in our Ribbit service, let's add a method to retrieve the timeline for a given user ID. So let's first go to our interface, and we want this method to return an IEnumerable of Ribbit. And let's just call this getTimeline4, and then the parameter is going to be a user ID. Then let's implement this method in our concrete Ribbit service class. Public, the return type is IEnumerable of Ribbit, get timeline for int user ID, and we want to use our Ribbit repository, so we will use the find all method, and then we want to, first of all, retrieve the author's followers, and we want to check if any of them have the ID of the supplied user ID. So that will get the ribbits of the people that the user with the supplied user ID follows, but we also need to get the ribbits for this user. So let's add an or, r.authorID equals user ID. And then we want to order these, descending, so order by descending, and then we will specify the date created property. And that's all that we need to do for the timeline. So let's go back to the home controller and let's go to the index action method. If the user is authenticated, then we want to get the timeline and pass it to the timeline view. So let's create a variable called timeline equals ribbits.getTimeline4. We want to specify the security.userID. Let's go ahead and execute that query with the toArray, and then we want to return a view. We're going to call this view timeline, and we will pass in the timeline as the model. Let's create that view by right-clicking, choose Add View. Let's call this Timeline. This is a strongly typed view of IEnumerable of Ribbit. This is not a partial view, and click Add. Let's first add a section for the right panel because this is going to contain our create form. So section right panel. And inside of this section, we want to call html.renderAction and then pass in underscore create ribbit partial. And that will render our create form. Then we need to use the left panel. So at section left panel, this is where we will display the timeline. Let's first check if we have anything to display, because this could be a new user and they might not have anything in their timeline. So let's use model.any, and if that's true, then we are going to loop over the model and display those ribbits. So for each var ribbit in model, and we don't have anything to display here. We're going to use another partial view. But let's go ahead and type it out. At html.partial, we'll call this underscore ribbit partial. And then we will pass in the ribbit for the model. But if there isn't anything to display, then let's at least display something. Quick, post a ribbit. And that is all we need for that to view. So we can go ahead and close the timeline. I believe we're also done with the service, so let's close Ribbit service and iRibbit service. Let's make sure that we are done with our home controller, because I think we can close that. No, we cannot. We didn't finish this code here. So we want to pass in the user ID, so we will use the security object, and then user ID, the status, so model.status, and we don't need to worry about the date. And then once we create the ribbit, then we want to redirect to the root. So response.redirect, and we want to go to the root. That finishes our home controller for now, so we can go ahead and close that. And now we just need to create that partial view, that underscore ribbit partial. So let's go to our views folder, and let's add this under shared. So right click on shared, add view, underscore ribbit partial. This is a strongly typed view for a ribbit, and this is a partial view. So click on add. And now we need to get the markup for this view. So let's look at our layout files once again. So I'm going to go to my downloads, layout, and we can probably find it in public. So I'm going to fire up Notepad, and let's see if we can find the markup in here. This is it right here, where we have a div with a class of ribbit wrapper. That's what we want, so I'm just going to copy that and paste it into this view. Now we will want to use the gravatar eventually, but we will get to that later on. But let's prefix this URL with a slash. We need to replace the name Kermit with the name of the user, so at model.author.profile. Actually, we might run into a problem here, but we will see if this works. Then we need the username. Now notice that we have an @ sign, and Visual Studio thinks that we are trying to use a variable called username. We need to escape this, so we are going to have two @ signs to display a literal out sign in the output, and then we will display the username, so model.author.username. We also want to display the time, and we're going to leave this with this 15 minutes for now. We will change that in a few minutes. And then we want to replace the status with simply model.status. Now the reason why I said that this might not work is because we're using the profile here, and in the controller I used that toArray method, so that will execute the query, so we might not have the profile data. But it might still be lazily loaded, and that's something too that we would want to address as far as performance. Because if it is going to be lazily loaded, then that means that we are making more database queries, and we don't want to make any more queries than we need to. So that might be something to address later on. But for right now, let's just run our application, and let's see if this works. No exceptions from the get-go, that's always a good sign. So let's log in, and we get an exception once we log in. We are missing a curly brace in our timeline view. Well, that's easy enough to fix. Let's open up our timeline view, and we just need to find where we need to put this. And I see it right here. We did not close, or rather I did not close, the right panel section. So let's go back to the browser and refresh, and we get something else. No route in the route table matches the supplied values. Oh, yes. When you're calling the render action method, you need to specify the action that you want to render. You don't want to pass the name of the partial view. So we want to render the create action, so that should fix that problem. So let's go back to the browser and refresh, and now everything works. We see our timeline, but of course we don't have anything in our timeline because this is a new user. So let's test our creation. This is our first ribbit. And if everything goes according to plan, the ribbit is created, and we can see that in our timeline. But notice that our profile information did not get loaded. We should see our display name here, except we don't have a display name, do we? No, we do not. Let's add some so that we can see if this is going to be working. So let's fire up our Management Studio, and we are going to edit our profile table. So drill down to the profiles, Right-click and choose Edit Top 200 Rows. And first I'm going to change my email to my actual email address, because whenever we pull in the Gravatar, we want to make sure that that is working. Let's put in my name for the name. Website bio we don't really care about. So now that we have some profile data, let's go back to the browser, refresh, and that information is indeed being pulled in, but it's probably being lazily loaded, and that's going to be okay for right now. Next, let's address this little timestamp here, and we want to do what Twitter does. If the age of a ribbit is less than an hour, then we want to display the amount of minutes that have passed since it was created. If it has been more than an hour, but it is less than 24 hours, then we want to list the hours, and then anything over 24 hours, we just want the abbreviated month and the day. And we can do this with an extension method for our Ribbit class. So let's go to our models folder, and I'm going to add a class called Ribbit Extensions. This is going to contain all of the extension methods for a Ribbit object. This class needs to be static, and let's name this method friendly timestamp. So public static string friendly timestamp. The only argument is going to be the ribbit itself. And the first thing we need to do is calculate the age of the ribbit. So we first need the time as it is right now. So datetime.now. Then let's get the date that the ribbit was created. So we will use ribbit.dateCreated. And then we want to get the time span. So let's call this span, and let's do now minus date. So let's first check if the amount of time is greater than 24 hours. So if span is greater than time span dot from hours 24, then we want to return date to string, and we want to use the format of MMM, that's the abbreviated month, and then day. That is a 2-digit day. Next, we want to check if the time span is greater than 60 minutes. So time span dot from minutes, pass in 60, and we want to return a string, and I'm going to use string.format, and we need to get the hours of this time span. So we would do span.hours. Next, we need to check if span is greater than time span dot from seconds, 60, and we want to do something similar that we did with hours, except that we want to specify the minutes. So 0m and then span.minutes. And if it's any less time than that, then we will just return now. So let's go to our ribbit partial, and let's replace this 15m with @model.friendlyTimestamp. Let's run this again. We need to log in, but once we log in, we will see our timeline, and we should see a friendly timestamp. That was made 13 minutes ago. Let's do something else. Hello, Ribbit. And we should see now. And we do, so that is working as intended. Next, let's get our Gravatar in here. So we're going to write another extension method, but we're going to do so for the user profile class. So right-click on the models folder and add a new class. I'm going to call this user profile extensions. And the name of this method is going to be get email hash, because that's what we need in order to retrieve the Gravatar for an email. You need the MD5 hash of that email address, and that email address has to be in all lowercase before you get the hash. So public static string get email hash, and the only parameter is the user profile, which I'm going to call P. And I'm going to paste this code in, and then we will talk about what it does. First of all, we retrieve the email, and we make it all lowercase. And then we get the MD5 hash of that email address, and that's going to be a byte array. But then once we have a byte array, we have to convert that back into a string. So we use a string builder. We convert each byte to a string, and then we return that hash as a string. So let's go back to our timeline. Actually, no, not the timeline. In the underscore ribbit partial. And instead of using this placeholder image, we're going to use http://www.gravatar.com/avatar/ and then we want model.author.profile and then get email hash. So let's run this one final time for this lesson. And after logging in, we see the gravatar. And that's bigger than what the placeholder image was, but really this is going to be okay. I kind of like it actually being bigger. In the next lesson, we're going to write the code to list all of the users. So we will be able to click on this profiles link and see all of the user profiles. And we already have a lot of the stuff necessary to get that to work done. So it should be a pretty quick lesson.